Hello, and welcome to another engaging episode of Stan the History Man. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler. I wanted to continue my discussion the other day on the Korean War, the early, the history, the beginning of Korea. And I did neglect, though, to include a very important topic, and that was the revolt in 1948 of a sizable proportion of the South Korean army on the island of Jeju. It was put down brutally by the new South Korean government, the Republic of Korea government. And historians estimate that maybe 100,000 Koreans died. Now, the Korean army, they had this revolt, which was pretty much pro-communist, and several units of the South Korean army did defect north to the North Koreans. But on the other hand, very few, can't say if any, but very few South Korean civilians went to the north. The conditions were pretty bad in the south, more chaotic, but in the north, conditions were brutal under the communists, the usual communist dictatorship. And so I figure that conditions must have been truly hellish in the north if the civilians of North Korea would defect to the south. You had a large influx of immigrants from the north, and that put a greater strain on the infant, fragile, poverty-stricken, corrupt South Korean government. So anyway, I wanted to point that out. And that brutalization, I think, was that as a result of Japanese colonialism. The Japanese went in there and they just ruled it with an iron hand. I said before, it's as bad as any European colonialism you can think of. We always think of imperialism and colonialism as something that the Europeans did, and some Americans too. But no, the Japanese did it, and they did it in a sense even more thoroughgoing than the British, the French, the Italians, whatever. Okay, now I wanted to get on to the actual eruption of the war and how that it was. I said before how it was completely unexpected on the Allied side. Half the South Korean army was on leave. That kind of puts the end of the theory that, actually the South Koreans started it. And it was, of course, a complete surprise to the Americans as well. Some advantage that the Americans had, though, is we had troops, 2 divisions on occupation duty in Japan, so we could fly them from Japan to Korea. And so that's what happened to them. And they were offloaded at Busan, the southernmost port in Korea. And there they were trucked north to a place called Osan, where they figured this is a good place to stop them. It had Task Force Smith. This was a small platoon size of American troops, fresh from occupation duty, to stop the South Koreans. And Task Force Smith has become almost a byword in the American Army now. I've heard it often spoken by high-ranking officers, generals, and so on. No more Task Force Smiths. And sometimes the GLs would groan like, "Oh yeah, we've heard this before." But it's a good point. You have to be better prepared than this. But Korea was so ignored. I mean, it was called the Hermit Kingdom even up till then, and people didn't even know where it was. But so these troops met on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th of July, met the North Koreans. And here you have a tank-led, there were no tanks at all in Korea on the Allied side, but this was a tank-led invasion with the superb Russian T-34. The T-34 85 was the marked number of it, and these were very good. And they pretty much, first of all, the tanks just rolled past the Americans, basically. I think we knocked out 1 or 2 of them. And but then pretty much we had the long load of trucks behind them, and we shot those up pretty much. And then the Americans had to retreat. And this began a retreat that was, up until then, the only retreat that comparable would be our retreat in the Philippines down to the Bataan Peninsula. So the Task Force Smith had been, they got off in good order, but they were defeated and forced to retreat. And a lot of writers and so on were talking about, they didn't put up much of a fight. They were soft from occupation duty and were caught by surprise, as it were. But actually, from the other point of view, they found a diary, for example, and a dead North Korean soldier said, Nero-san, we fought a great battle. So, take that for what it's worth. But the Americans had to continuously retreat from one river line to the other, the Han River, the Kum River, putting up a defense, but the North Koreans would go around the defenses and get us in the back. And the really big battle was fought in Khe-Sanh, which we've, at least in this case, we fought very well. It was quite a ding-dong battle in the streets of Khe-Sanh. And one of the problems we faced there was we had our bazookas were they could not penetrate the Russian tanks. And actually, these were World War II bazookas. Even the Germans had a better bazooka that they issued to teenagers in the last days of the war, the Panzerfaust. They issued to the German teenagers and elderly people in the very last month and weeks of the war. So ours was pretty inferior. But by the time of this big battle here, some of these 3.5 diameter bazookas were finally in stock. And so a large number of the tanks, Russian tanks, were knocked out. This is also the last example of the North Korean Air Force, the People's Air Force, strafing, because we pretty well knocked the North Korean Air Force out of the sky by that time. They also dropped surrender leaflets on the Americans to do the right thing and surrender to us. I don't think the GIs by this time were buying that. But the general commanding the troops here got out of the city, but he eventually was captured himself and was made a prisoner of war till the end of the war. But line after line, we tried to hold up, and they were went around, skirted them, and then came around behind us. And so a continuous retreat. Remember, of course, that the South Korean army was also fighting alongside us there. We're fighting alongside them. And it's kind of indicative of the war that both the commander of the North Korean army, who was nicknamed King Kong, was killed fairly early in the war, roughly this time, and the commander of the South Korean army, perhaps a rather incompetent general named Fat Che, not the sort of leader you want to alongside you. However, he did in the end fight bravely, but was killed. So within a month of the war, both leaders on either side were killed, which shows what kind of a war this is. And one of the problems we faced was this long line of Korean civilians. And I always say, you want to know who's on the right side? See, well, which way do the people, the refugees come? And it was a long, long stream. And there was really some heartbreaking episodes where they were trying to cross one of the river lines that we set up there on the bridge. And we said, we got to blow the bridge. I mean, the enemy is coming. We got to blow it right now. And they wouldn't go back. They just kept forcing their way forward on the bridge. And sometimes we had to blow the bridge with people on it. I mean, it's one of those, that's kind of the way things go sometimes in war. And this continued. However, things began to break a little bit better for the Allied forces by this time. One, our supply lines were getting shorter and their supply lines were getting longer. So things began to slow down a bit. However, the North Koreans cleared all of Korea except for a perimeter around the port of Pusan in the South Korea. I'll show you my map in my book here. My book. Here is the Pusan perimeter. This right here. It's a rather small, the line or the dark line. That's the Pusan perimeter, which roughly follows the Nak Tong River, or surrounds the port of Pusan, which was the only major city in South Korea which didn't fall to the communists. They established this line, and very hard fighting. And I remember reading about one battle in which the very with our air power plus our beefed up artillery and so on, inflicted very, very heavy casualties on the North Koreans, and the propaganda said, breaking in panic and despair, the American imperialists ran away. And not at all. We stopped them cold and inflicted very heavy casualties on them. We suffered heavy casualties too, I admit. But the propaganda, I think that's one thing I notice in this is nothing original, but in dictatorships, they overdo the propaganda. It's just like when Stalin whipped up support for the Stockholm Peace Appeal. Would you believe in this 1950, a little later? Do you believe in outlawing war? And do you believe in peace? And he said that and a lot of people, famous people, signed up on this thing. But Stalin said 99% of the Soviet population signed up that petition. Well, I mean, come on, you know that's not going to be true. And this is another example. The Americans are cowards running away, and yet we stopped them at the Pusan perimeter. Now, of course, one great advantage we've had is no more North Korean Air Force. And by this time, we really ranged heavily up and or all along the Pusan perimeter. One of the things that improved our position there was a lot of equipment that we had at the very beginning of the war was worn out. Before the war, the United States really embarked upon a disarmament program under Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson. He said, I'm going to cut all the fat out. Well, they cut a lot of muscle, too. And so a lot of equipment, especially radio equipment, still just was not working. And sometimes the bazookas wouldn't fire because the electrical circuit was worn out, whatever, or not worn out, but decayed in the heat and humidity in Japan. But there was an operation called Roll Up, and they took a lot of tanks and trucks and jeeps and so on and rebuilt them. And this, in a sense, was the seed for the Japanese revival after the war. By 1948, Germany was well on its way. As a matter of fact, I saw my first Volkswagen in Germany in 1948. But it took longer in Japan for reasons which I'm not sure of. But then they said the Korean War is what kick-started the Japanese economic revival, and one of those was Operation Roundup. So the situation was improving steadily at this time, and of course supplies were coming in by sea into the port of Pusan. It's this fairly respectable port that the Japanese had built, and they really developed Korea in many ways. It didn't do much for the Koreans themselves, but it was a major resource for Japan, Japan's colony. And, actually, within 2 days, when MacArthur landed in Korea himself, went to Korea, he was close enough to the North Korean lines that he heard the explosion of they told you about the Kum River line that has exploded with about a third of the Korean army, or South Korean army, on the wrong side. He then even was thinking, I worked out in his mind a plan to defeat them by landing behind them. He claims that I think he did mention that to several officers that the best way to deal with these people is cut them off at the beginning of their assault. And so he's planning this even while we are fighting desperately to hang on. There were experts and so on saying that we're going to have to evacuate. We'll have to evacuate through the port of Pusan. With our air power, we can probably get away with a sort of a Dunkirk thing, which we leave our equipment behind, but we can take the troops off. But MacArthur's thinking, I'm going to get those guys yet. And what he did in September 15th was the famous Incheon landing, in which he sent troops, a whole new corps of 2 divisions of troops and Marines way behind the lines at the port of Incheon, which is the port of Seoul. I often wonder why Seoul was the port. It has like a 10-foot high tide range. So there's only certain hours of the day that you can use it, but that was their port, and that's where we landed, to the total consternation of the North Koreans. And Kim Il Sung, the North Korean prime minister, said, "You better give me some equipment and so on to fortify Incheon." And Mao Zedong said, "No, you don't have to worry. The Americans aren't going to land there." See, there was a better landing facility further south. I forget the name of it now, and that's where all the experts on the other side. That's where we're going to land, because there are level beaches there, and that's what's. Well, MacArthur said that's the whole point, that they're not going to expect me there, and so it was a very surprise landing. It caught them flat-footed. And the Americans landed with very few casualties. In fact, the only casualty at the actual landing was a guy named Lieutenant Svensson, who was killed by a North Korean bomb. Some of their airplanes were still flying, and he was on the USS Swenson. The historians say that said Swenson. I guess he got put on because maybe, because that was his father's, named after his father, so he got on. It's kind of interesting. The only casualty, the only fatality in the Incheon landing. Now, after we landed and got on land, the North Koreans fought ferociously to protect them from our assault into the capital city of Seoul itself. But at the same time as with the landing in Incheon behind the North Koreans, we began to break out of the Pusan perimeter, thus catching the North Koreans between two, north and south. And that brings up a point I want to talk about. Saying, "Oh, well, the Americans, they were weak, and they were occupation duty, that type of thing." But nobody ever talks about, well, look at the North Koreans. They stampeded north. Now, they had a very strongly disciplined army, one of the strongest in the world. I mean, you could be shot for a number of offenses, and yet they took off. They just stampeded north. It was almost like a roundup type of thing. So, and I should also make another point that by about 1948, the occupation troops in Korea, their mission was changed from keeping Japan. I mean, the occupation forces in Japan changed from keeping the Japanese quiet. The war is over and they got to live with it, to the communists, the Russians. Of course, the Chinese victory in 1949, and of course Stalin's the Berlin airlift was going on at that time. So we began, the Cold War is beginning here. So they did do a lot of training, and one of the problems of the training in Japan was there's so little level land, and what level land there is usually occupied by rice paddies. I also thought, well, that speaks something for our army. We could just take it over a rice paddy and made it, a training field for tanks or infantry or whatever. We didn't. We just had to live with it. That we didn't have all the land that we wanted for like long range artillery preparation or training and that sort of thing. So just a comment or two on the quality of the soldiers in the American army, and a lot of the North Koreans. One of their propaganda brochures and how the Americans were cowardly and they wouldn't fight hard and they played possum when and we quoted that. Well, I mean, the North Koreans said it, so it's got to be true. And in most cases, it was not true. I mean, there were instances of indiscipline and so on, of course, but it's nothing like it's made out to be. In most cases, the Americans fought well. We certainly held the line at Pusan after the initial retreat. So anyway, it was like a nutcracker that the tightly disciplined, motivated North Koreans were found. Here they are. Here were the cowardly Americans retreating, and the South Koreans retreating from them. But all of a sudden, there were a bunch of tanks behind them shooting them up. And that, I think, maybe it's just overly stiff discipline. Something's overly stiff, it cracks. It doesn't bend, it cracks. And that the North Korean discipline cracked. And we took Seoul, fairly hard fighting in Seoul, urban fighting. But the North Koreans gave up the city of Seoul to the imperialists. I mean, this is what they should be. They're fighting to the end for this city, but now it was taken by the Americans. And then as we got north of Seoul, MacArthur he was a great hero that he had pulled this thing off to the consternation of the North Koreans, and it worked. I think he sort of gotten bit by the bug of hubris, of pride, because he divided the Eighth Army into two corps, the Eighth Army and then 10th Corps, and he put 10th on the east coast of North Korea, and the Eighth Army on the Eighth coast of North Korea, or the eighth side of the peninsula of North Korea. And this was the supplies. They got tangled in each other, and they just didn't seem to understand the supply problem there. But they still pushed northward. And matter of fact, then they captured the North Korean capital, Pyongyang, which again makes me wonder. This is their capital. I mean, this is, and it wasn't as hard fighting for Pyongyang as there were for Seoul. There was for Seoul. So we continued northward, and MacArthur's grinding on, and he got these two Army Corps separated from each other because in between them was mountain range, and there's almost no contact. Even radio contact was bad because of the mountains, the radios of that time, between 10th Corps, 8th Corps, and 10th Corps and 8th Army, and they pressed northward. And then, of course, the big question is how far north do we go? Because, as you know, north of the Yalu River divides China and North Korea, or all of Korea, if you will. Interestingly, also, there is a small, let me see if my map shows this, or one of my maps here shows the border between Korea and Russia. Right here. It doesn't actually show it. Yeah, but anyway, about halfway up is the border with Russia. And fairly early in the war, two P-80s, who must have been lousy navigators, crossed the border, went deeply into Russia, but about 100 miles into Russia. I mean, what's 100 miles in Russia? And shot up an airfield there. Well, I mean, this is like grounds for war, and Stalin was furious, but he backed off because both sides didn't want to get into a war with each other. But I figured, what would happen if some Russian planes came over from, let's say, from Alaska, across the Bering, came over from Siberia, crossed the Bering Straits, purely by accident, of course, and shot up Ladd Air Force Base in Alaska? We'd go berserk. I mean, it would be very hard not to declare war. You know, you're giving into the commies and whatever. But the other side did not. I mean, there were times when Stalin, some common sense broke through, and he said, "Okay, you dirty capitalists, compensate me for this," and that was it. Basically, the diplomats on either side and worked it out. But I think it's kind of interesting when we think of how, you know, Stalin was just ruthless, and any opportunity he could get against explore, he knew when to back off at times. At least, so we're heading north now. It's getting colder. You're getting October, November. And North Korea is very cold because you get these howling Mongolian blizzards coming down from the north, and it is really cold. Soldiers who fought in North Korea said they've never had such experience. Even guys from Minnesota or whatever, North Dakota, so they haven't experienced that kind of. And yet MacArthur just pushed on, and rather recklessly. We've got him on the run, and he had a general, General Almond, who was really kind of a jerk. I think you say he was giving the guys medals for anything, and he was saying, you're not going to be held up by a bunch of Chinese laundrymen, because people are saying, oh, the Chinese are going to come in. Don't be held up by a bunch of Chinese laundrymen. And so we just plunged northward without too much security. And actually, some advanced units did reach the Yalu River and were photographed there, smiling and grinning. You know, here I am, the Yalu River is right behind me, and China. And by this time, our intelligence began to spot Chinese troops, and they captured some Chinese troops. And the maps, they have these little egg-shaped things. Well, there's some Chinese troops here, and there's some Chinese troops over there. But nothing serious. What I do in Korea? Well, they're just kind of like warning us, maybe, be careful, don't try to invade China because we can be here. Nothing really serious, though. Yeah, those those eggs there, they're called these intelligence eggs, are kind of the thing that followed MacArthur at the end of his days. And then in early November, the Chinese crossed the Yalu, and we didn't see them. We didn't. And we were flying over the Yalu all the time. I mean, flying along the Yalu River and looking, and they were not seen. The Chinese, the discipline of the Chinese army, they cross at night, and they say, if one of you guys even lights a cigarette, you're dead. We'll shoot you. So any violation of discipline, of light discipline, could result in being shot right on the spot. So we just Willoughby, with General Willoughby, was MacArthur's intelligence officer, and somebody said MacArthur didn't have a staff; he had a court, and these are people who just, in a sense, worshiped the ground that MacArthur walked on. And if MacArthur said, I don't think they're going to intervene in this war. There's a few of them here and there, yeah, but it's kind of an open border, so they kind of slip across. But don't worry. And then they hit us, and it was one of the great intelligence failures of modern history. We just didn't see them coming, and we were hit. First, the Chinese they were clever. They hit a South Korean division. Now, the South Koreans were kind of trained on a lick and a promise because they did not have long military experience. The Chinese wouldn't allow that, and so they just didn't have the experience to stand against this defeat. And I think it was the South Korean 6th ROK division was slaughtered and pushed back, and then it worked, and they said, well, let's hit the Americans, and so they hit the American 2nd Division, and they really heavy casualties were inflicted there. I remember reading about where's the 2nd Division? So we don't know, but anyway, a Air Force reconnaissance plane or Army reconnaissance plane flew. Oh, there it is. And they saw this long line of trucks and everything, but they noticed that the hoods in the trucks, that there was snow on them. Well, that means the motors aren't running, and they dive down a little bit lower to see what's going on, and there were a lot of dead GIs. In other words, the trucks were dead, the GIs were dead too. So it was a pretty serious defeat that we suffered, and the most of the division did keep going south, but it was a gauntlet. They had to run a gauntlet. The Chinese were up in the hills, blasting away at them, and that is the beginning of the longest retreat in American military history, all the way from up to the Yalu River, from northmost region of Korea down to just below the 38th parallel. Now, that was a disaster there, the Great Retreat, particularly the 2nd Division. However, other American troops were more like in the middle of North Korea, around the Chosin Reservoir, the frozen Chosin, and they were able to get off the reservoir and consolidate themselves. And the Marines, especially in the north, were able to consolidate in the face and resist in the face of Chinese attacks. Well, that's the Marine Corps for you. And they made this incredibly long, hundreds of miles long, from center of North Korea to the coast of North Korea, the long march out, starting at the Chosin Reservoir. One of the things they had to cross was this huge power plants, and we had blown them up, the pentstocks and the pipes and so on, and we dropped a Bailey Bridge right near it. And so the Bailey Bridge, one of these military bridges, were able to get the U.S. troops and Marines off across that. And then they basically fought their way out. Now, it's interesting. I don't think the Chinese fought ferociously. The main enemy we had then was the cold in these medic tents, MASH, if you will. The blood and plasma actually freeze in the equipment. A lot of wounded were flown out, though. But most of the troops and the Marines and so on walked out, and they even brought their dead with them. A lot of the dead was just stacked up in the backs of trucks, frozen. They're not, nothing's going to happen to them until they got to the port of Hungnam. They're fighting all the way, but probably not. I'm not sure. Maybe the Chinese had expended most of their energy and their supplies in the, driving the Americans on the Eighth Army on the East Coast south. But there was fighting. But I would say, in a sense, that the biggest enemy was the cold, and most veterans of that long march remember the cold more than they remember being attacked by Chinese soldiers. So we got to the town of Hungnam, which we still occupy from the earlier, the invasion northward. And this is one of the really incredible stories of modern military history. Under the command of General Ammen, I said what a jerk he was, but he was great dealing with supplies and movement and so on. He was a great staff officer, if you will. And we brought in, of course, troop ships, transports, and whatever. And we evacuated every single living American soldier out of Hungnam, that enclave, held the Chinese off, and even the equipment. I saw something I've never seen referred to at the time or later. I was in the National Archives, and here was a photograph of a long line of Russian troops, Russian trucks. And they're all very neatly packed. You know how they pack the vehicles for shipment? They tape over the windows, and they're all neatly done like this and lined up. There must have been 50 of them, at least, Russian troops. I keep saying it, Russian trucks. And I'm wondering, I guess we captured them from the North Koreans or the Chinese, and we put them on ships and sent them south. We probably gave them to the South Koreans. I thought, we talk about Dunkirk was a great retreat, and it was, but only the blokes got off. All the equipment was left behind. They certainly weren't bringing any German equipment back to England, but that's what we were doing. So every single American soldier and Marine, every military American there got out. I had a very good friend, roommate when I was at Columbia, who was part of that march out, and he said the first thing he got on. I'm just thinking, they're cold, frigid all this time, and then they get into a troop transport, let's say, with steam heat and showers and whatever. But the first thing he knows, when he got on board, there was a Navy corpsman there handing out mound spars to everybody, and they all threw them up again because they've been living on basically frozen beans and their sea rations, and they just threw them up again. But then he went down to his bunk there, and he took off his shoes, and all he had left in his socks were just a ring around the elastic around the top, and he didn't even recognize himself. He looked in the mirror. He's just all overgrown with facial hair and so on, but he survived. Of course, what kind of memories he had, but that's kind of typical of he was a Marine at that time. So they all were evacuated out, plus all their equipment, plus a lot of enemy equipment, and evacuated out to the port of Pusan. That's good, but still, as a retreat, we were getting out of there, and that land was given over to the North Koreans. So they continued to push southward, and they took Seoul again. So Seoul had been taken 3 times, first by the communists, then by us, and then by the communists again, and then we 4 times. Then we later on we pushed them out of Seoul, and about, I would say, 20 miles, 25, 30 miles south of some of these battles are hard to explain because they're like all over the place. We stopped them. The Battle of the Two Tunnels, there were these 2 railroad tunnels around which the battle surged, and we stopped them cold. And one of the things, something good that was happening in the war for us, MacArthur he had earlier he'd written to a congressman saying there's no substitute for victory. What we're doing in Korea is wrong. We should just go in there and invade China or something. We're still not sure exactly what he's calling for. And Truman said, no, this is a limited war. In fact, early in the war, some newspaper reported, well, what kind of a war are we in now? We haven't declared war or anything. And one of the newspapermen said, do you mean just like a police action? And Truman said, yes, you could say that. Now, he never called it a police action, but he agreed with someone who said it's like a police action. And MacArthur, that's not the way you fight a war. Victory, there is no substitute for victory. And finally, Truman said, I can't put up with this anymore, and he fired him. And, people say something, well, that's a clash between the military and the civilian. MacArthur never challenged Truman's right to fire him. He said, he's a jerk to fire me, and he shouldn't have done that, and we're going to lose to the communists. But he has every right. He's my commander in chief. And so MacArthur packed his bags and went home. And, it's interesting. MacArthur's finest hour, I think, was when he was ruling the supreme commander in Japan. And he, you could say, won the hearts of the Japanese people, because when he left, there were all kinds of people around the Daiichi building, where the American military government was, almost in some cases weeping to see Mikasa-san having to leave. He was a hero to so many of them. And he himself felt that the best thing he ever did in his life was to turn Japan around, which in many respects he did. He brought democracy to Japan. There was early in the occupation, there was the Japanese Communist Party. It's kind of odd to think any survived the Japanese emperor, but anyway, there was Japanese maybe just farmed then, and wanted to have a demonstration. And so a lot of the brass was saying, well, we can't have communist demonstrations right in the middle of Tokyo. And MacArthur said, we can't tell these people to be democratic if we just say, well, we can't have this one and we can't have that one. He said, and he let the communists have a demonstration. And that really kind of made the Japanese think, well, yeah, maybe democracy makes some sense. At any rate, he was missed by the Japanese. They really were sorry to see him go. And just to finish MacArthur's story to the end, I remember vividly when it happened. It was a sensation. MacArthur fires Truman, screaming headlines in the news. We used to have newspapers back then, screaming headlines in the newspapers. MacArthur fires Truman. And a lot of, especially the Republican Party, very much opposed to what, agreed with MacArthur. We got to end this war with victory. And so he was invited to speak before Congress. A lot of people, MacArthur for president, he'll really shape us up. He'll show the commies where to get off. And he gave us, and I remember the speech he gave, old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And it was, I heard it on the radio at the time. And he was applauded. I don't remember hearing any kind of a congressional State of the Union message or anything. It was greeted like MacArthur's speech. This would be in April of 1950. Well, he's fired in April. I think the speech was in May of 1951. And the demonstrations were just, they just never died down. And so then the next thing is MacArthur for president. And so he gave another speech before Congress and was to the Republican convention, July of 1951. And it was kind of like, I am MacArthur. I want to do this, and I don't want us to do that. And it's like, people were just, winding their watches. We had windable watches in those days, or looking at the ceiling, and that just took the air out of the MacArthur for president. Boom! It was the balloon, if you will. That was the end of that. At any rate, getting back to the war itself, to take his place, General Van Fleet was put in charge. And Van Fleet had a good combat record in World War II. And he was on staff duty at the time of MacArthur's firing. But he came and he saw a lot of holes in the Army when he was there, a certain amount of lack of discipline or whatever. And probably because of the defeat was really discouraging a lot of the jails. Like, well, they're going to evacuate from here anyway. But he brought a new spirit into the Army. And I would say, not Van Fleet. No, what's his name now? I can't think of it. This general was, I would say, one of the best generals that we ever had. The guy that turned around the battle in Korea, the war in Korea, stabilized the lines, pushed back against the North Koreans, and we retook Seoul again. Now there wasn't much left of Seoul by this time, but at least it was in Allied hands again. And this is basically along the 38th parallel. And so for the rest of the war, it was a pretty well fought in that general area. And it became like World War One. Here you have the war, first they push us down and we push them back and they push us back down again. And then both sides dug in. And both sides, because they didn't want to get into a major war, understandably. Except MacArthur had different ideas, but by then he kind of faded out of the picture. So about in June of 1951, on the July 51, on the first anniversary of the war, the in the United Nations, the North Korean delegate said it is time for a peace in Korea, and so they proposed. Truce. We began truce negotiations. That sounds very contemporaneous now. True to ceasefire at Kaesong, and it's typical the way the communists do things. They said, "Now you drive up to this." Kaesong was in a battle zone. There's no neither side. Both sides were contending for it. You drive up to here in your jeeps, but put up white flags there for convenience, so we don't get fired on. We care about human life. So the Americans, fat, dumb, and happy, sure, we'll put up white signs. So then they took pictures of all these American jeeps coming up here with white flags. The Americans are surrendering. And that's, of course, what they said. They were going to sign a surrender. They also made sure that we approached from the south. And in Korean culture, excuse me, in Korean culture, the defeated approaches the victor from the south to the north. So, oh yes, the cowardly Americans are finally surrendering. Well, it took us 2 years to surrender. Negotiations for a truce, where to draw the line and that type of thing. And the thing that really, we almost had gotten to sign some kind of a truce, but the thing that really held it up for 2 years, from 1951, almost exactly from July 51 to July 27, 1953, we could not crack the issue of prisoners of war. Now, by all international law, when the war is over, both sides exchange prisoners. We sent the Germans back to Germany, from the prisoner of war camps. They sent all the prisoners we had. You do that, but not in this case, because a lot of North Koreans and Chinese did not want to go back to their socialist paradises. I think one of the reasons also was that a lot of the Chinese communists were actually nationalists, had been defeated by the communists and press ganged into the Chinese Communist Party. So their army, their heart wasn't really into this war. And we had a large number of surrenders. We talk about, they were such hard fighters. No, well, they a lot of surrendering. In fact, there are 22,000 Chinese and North Koreans that said, we don't want to go back. Which, it's not the same thing as to say, well, I surrender and I'll go home. No, I surrender, I got to stay here. And I don't know what kind of country it is in South Korea, what they're going to do to me. Ship me to America. I don't know. But they did. And the communists said, well, international law, you return the prisoners, so give us our guys back again. And Truman knew history. He was a student of history. He remembered that after World War II, there were a lot of Russian Red Army troops that didn't want to go back. Some of them were from the fringes of Ukraine, and they didn't want to go back to the country that they hated. And the British forced them back with somewhat enthusiasm, put those Huns back where where they belong. But the Americans had a kind of a guilty conscience about that. Matter of fact, there were so-called Russians, or let's say people at the fringe of the Russia, that were committing suicide rather than return to Russia. The British said, as well, the Germans they started, and we'll just let them go. But we had kind of a guilty conscience about it, and so we did not return a lot of these Russians, some of whom had actually fought with the Germans in the war, and I'd say the British weren't about to accommodate them. But so Truman remembered that forcible repatriation. It was in many respects, a bloody business. I'm not going to do that this time, he said. And so for 2 years, basically negotiated. Well, how, and they finally came up with a way. They had the Indians come in, the neutral Indians, and from India, not, Columbus fouls everything up, calling it the North American indigenous people Indians. They were screening all the prisoners, and they say, now, do you want to go back or don't you? So basically a neutral atmosphere to pretty well determine which of those really mean it. And they determined about 22,000 of them, and there were 22 Americans. I think that 22 Americans who didn't chose repatriation. Oh, well, that's American. What's happened to American youth? That these people actually go over to the communists. They must have been brainwashed. Okay, that was the thing. Also, brainwashing, and eventually, I believe, in the course of history, the next 20 years, all 22 of them were allowed to go back. They went back. I think one died in North Korea. So there's a big hullabaloo. In fact, there's a book, In Every War But One. In Every War But One, Americans all came home, but in Korea it was different. And then there was another one called March to Calmly, which refuted that and showed just how few there were, and that these eventually they all came back. There were a lot of, you might call, side stories about the Korean War. That, for example, germ warfare. The communists accused of engaging in germ warfare. And a lot of scientists who should have known better said, well, there might be something to that, because Americans are pretty nasty people. And we did have poison gas, which we never used in World War II or in Korea. And the communists, the Chinese communists, said, well, we're using all kinds of bugs, fleas and everything. That's not a very efficient way to spread warfare. But that's what, and I've seen actual original documents but the communists I found in our archives saying, like, well, now we will kill these people and put them in a hut here and have the international correspondents come along and say, aha, you see, these are people killed by poison gas. So it was a gigantic fraud. Okay. But I would say a lot of people should have. A guy called Needham was one of the great bacteriological scientists in the world. He was saying, oh, I think there was something there, and the Americans are working on it. That doesn't mean they were using it, but okay, anyway. So the germ warfare thing was kind of a typical communist propaganda. And saying germ warfare also. A number of our pilots who had been shot down said, well, we did do that. We dropped these containers, but they were, they're being tortured if they didn't sign in. We've learned all that from the POWs in Vietnam. So anyway, the negotiations finally, with the Indian help, to come in and discussed in privacy whether the guys wanted to go back for real or not. And so the armistice was signed on the 27th of July, 1953. I don't know if it was coincidental or what, but Eisenhower had come in January of 53. And I just wonder if well, he's a military man. We better wind this thing up. And it was causing, you wonder what China went through. Here they went through World War II and they lost 25 million dead. Then they go through the Korean War, which probably caused another million dead. Mao Zedong lost his own son in the Korean War. So they probably, I guess they were, of course, Russia would help them with aid and everything, but Stalin was kind of parsimonious with a lot of his aid. So they saw just gone long enough. And Eisenhower kind of said, well, we use the atom bomb in Korea, Mr. President. He said, well, we will not dismiss any sort of weapon that might help us. So, that kind of could be interpreted saying, well, we'll drop the bomb if we have to. Of course, everyone was frightened of the bomb. The Russians got the bomb in 1949, and from then on, the Cold War really intensified. They've got the bomb too. And every time there was an explosion or some people, I thought that was the bomb. So it's just the Cold War the Korean War was getting old. I think both sides saw it in there. That was the best thing to do, was to wind it up. But North Korea remained, as a hard rock communist. conduct a number of border incidents took place after the signing of the armistice between both sides. And so about 30,000 Americans died in the war. So it was not exactly a minor war, but it wasn't a major war either, one of these smallish wars that did not bloom into anything bigger. One of the things I should also mention was our control of air power in the Korean War, the MiGs and the F-80s. The first time that both sides had used jet aircraft in World War II, but they had not clashed with each other. But in Korea, for the first time, you had the famous MiG-15 and the American F-80. In some respects, the MiG was more advanced. It had swept wings, for example. Actually, most of the engine, this is interesting, the engine for the MiG-15 came from the British. He said, why don't the British run our side? Well, you see, right after the war, Russia was our glorious ally, and England needed money. And they had Rolls-Royce engines. That's good stuff. So the Russians bought it straight out. They didn't steal it or espionage or anything. They just think, we buy one of your Rolls-Royce Nene, any Rolls-Royce Nene engines, and they built a aircraft frame around it. Now, the early Russian jets did look like the German Me-262s, the same basic type of thing. The Me-262 had a swept wing. So in that respect, now I think the engines were the General Electric engines in the F-80 and the Rolls-Royce Nene and the MiG-15 were roughly comparable. And in most cases, they were, I think people talk about, wonder weapon, we'll win the war with this or whatever. I think advanced industrial countries, and Russia was kind of that, had the same. I think World War II, the British and the German aircraft were roughly comparable. They had some clunkers, and so did the Germans have some clunkers, and they had some excellent aircraft. So at any rate, these two were pretty well matched. However, we shot them down at about the rate of 12-1. And that's propaganda. No, it wasn't. It was serious historians still figure that's about the closest. You never know exactly. I mean, a plane may have had malfunction and was claimed to have been shot down, that type of thing. But they can figure a ratio of 12-1. And a big secret of the war is who's flying these things. I mean, do the Chinese have jet pilots? And the answer is, well, not quite. No, they didn't. So they were an entire Russian air division under absolute total secrecy was sent to the Korean War. And in fact, there was an incident where one MiG was shot down just behind U.S. lines, or the battle line. I think it was contested line. And the other MiGs strafed him to make sure he wouldn't get away or survive and tell the story. They killed their own to keep that secret that those are Russian soldiers. And some of our F-80 pilots could hear them speaking in Japanese. Well, the F-80s were replaced by our F-86, the North American F-86, which was even more of in many respects, better than the MiG-15. Better gun sights, too, the electronic gun sight, probably better electronics all over, but it was still a worthy opponent. But the problem was they didn't have the experience. They were fighting in World War II, but it wasn't so much fighter to fighter. Mostly the Russians used ground attack aircraft and did a very good job of it. Excellent. The Sturmovik was an excellent ground to crack aircraft, but that's not providing training for fighter plane to fighter plane. Might also be the fact that Americans were more familiar with mechanics. I mean, it seemed like every GI had a car at home up on blocks until he comes back from the war, that type of thing, or a hot rod of his own. And so they could deal with the mechanical problems. I don't mean they actually went and repaired them, but I mean, they were just more familiar with mechanical and electric and electronic things. So we really wiped out or not wiped them out because they had plenty of them, but we certainly gave them a hard time at a 12-1 ratio. On the other hand, the North shot down more of our planes. And, well, how can that be? You just told, no, from ground attack. Because we were all throughout the war, from the beginning to the end, we're attacking, railroad bridges and roads and tank convoys and so on. And they were very clever at having concealed anti-aircraft emplacements and so on. And so it was ground attack was a dangerous operation to go on to in North Korea. And actually, one of the most successful of their planes was a little biplane observation. If you look at it, you think it was almost like a World War I airplane. It was a slow biplane um, reconnaissance aircraft because they could fly slow and they could take photographs. And this thing, they called them Washing Machine Charlie because they could hear him coming over American bases with like a ronka, ronka, ronka. And he dropped bombs and so on parked American planes. They several hundred, I think, of our aircraft were wiped out by Washing Machine Charlie. And he couldn't show up on the radar screen because so much of it was made out of wood and fabric. In fact, there was one Navy night fighter crashed right through it. They didn't even see him. So you can argue they may have lost out in jet to jet, but boy, in ground attack and defense against ground attack, they were very good. They had things like they'd take the track off a certain section, maybe half a mile of track, and lay it by the side like, oh, it's been bombed already, so I don't have to worry about that. But they put it back together at night. They would park their trains, especially the locomotives, inside caves where track was going through caves. Korea's all hills. I mean, they said it's the biggest country in the world. If you hammer it out flat, it would cover the world. And so we couldn't spot them. So they were very, very good at tactical air, shooting down airplanes and hiding all their equipment. So we had complete air superiority in the air, but on the ground, it was another story. In fact, one of the American commanders said, I'd like to meet the guy that was responsible for air defense in North Korea. I'd like to meet my opposite number and to find out how they did it all. So the other thing where we had complete strategic control is at sea. There was I think the biggest American ship sunk in the war was, I think, a destroyer escort off the port of Hongnam, and it ran into a mine. But we had aircraft carriers over there just bombing around the clock. And continue with air, I should point out also that we obliterated. Pyongyang became a Dresden East. We leveled, that's the capital, North Korea, we leveled it. To the whole population, what was left, had been evacuated, whatever, lived underground. So it was like, it didn't all happen in one night like Dresden, but it happened over a period of months. So we completely controlled the air that way. And then the sea, aircraft, naval air, were around the clock. And there wasn't an awful lot that the communists, the Chinese and the North Koreans could do about it. We even had battleships. I believe all four of the Missouri class, not all at once, but they rotated to Korea. I know the battleship I was on, the New Jersey, had battle stars for Korea because it was great. It was a fire and forget weapon. Aircraft, they might get shot down by that excellent North Korean anti-aircraft and spend the rest of the war as a POW. But they fire those 16-inch guns and then forget about them because they're going to cause some devastation wherever they lasted. So on sea and in the air, our supremacy was hardly unchallenged, air to air, of course, and offshore operations. But it's interesting. I should also point out, and I'll have to wrap this up pretty soon, but before the war, we weren't concerned about, well, there might be a war in Korea. I mean, look at the Chinese communists, they've taken over and Russia's got an atom bomber. We were all concerned about big war. And how will we fight the next war? And it seemed like every time we plan the next war, we get it wrong. It was the age of push button warfare then. And I say, usually what we wind up is in somebody else's rice paddy, okay? Down and dirty. But what the big question was whether it was the B-36, the 6-engine multi-monster bomber, which could drop an atom bomb and fly around the world doing it, or aircraft the newest aircraft carriers, the super carriers. And I don't think they were nuclear power, planned for nuclear power then, but that was still very big and could, again, an enormous air power and in them. So what should we put our money on? Building lots of aircraft carriers or building lots of B-36s? And there was, the resignations and scandals and everything, payoff supposedly to deal with that. And right in the middle of that, we get into a war fought by people in canvas tennis shoes and cotton jackets and but firing very good machine guns, and we were just caught flat-footed by that. And it happens almost every time that we think it's going to be the war of the future. Never works out to be the war of the future. Well, you can't foretell the future, whether military history or regular history. It seems like almost every Nostradamus predicting the future doesn't get it right. It's almost the exact opposite. But at any rate, when the end of the Korean War, Eisenhower pretty well, I would say he ended it, but they realized that it's gone on long enough. And it was in the interest of both sides to end the Korean War on July 27th, 1953. Now, the final battle line at that just near the 38th parallel was the final division between North and South Korea, and which it still is. So it's not a line that was laid out by diplomats and that type of thing. No, it was the battle. It was paid in blood by both sides. That's what it is. And by the way, there is no. We say we ought to have a peace treaty with North Korea and South Korea. They never went to war. I mean, they never declared war. I hear a lot of writers who should know better saying, well, the last time we declared war or anybody declared war was in the Korean War in 1950. That's not true, because when North Korea invaded South Korea, they didn't want to say we're invading, Republic of Korea. There's a bunch of gangsters, of suck-ins with the imperialists. We don't dignify them with a declaration of war. And the South Koreans said, well, these are just a bunch of puppets of Kim Il Sung, of Mao Zedong and Stalin. We're not going to dignify them with a declaration of war. So it never was declared in the first place. I don't know when the last declaration of war was, but that's another story. So we're still waiting for some kind of a rapprochement and leading to a peace treaty between North and South Korea. Well, thank you very much. We'll look forward to hearing from you and to talking to you again. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler. Bye-bye.